certified inventor of FM synthesis. He's also the recipient of the Knobcon 2019 Lifetime Achievement Award. Dr. John Chowning.
Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and I thank Eric for seeing that his mom took care of all the details. So thank you, Sarah. I'm sure she does much for everyone. So I have a couple of confessions to make. First, I'm probably the only person in the room who doesn't know how to solder. And second confession is, I'm not a very funny person. I've never been to Toastmasters to learn how to entertain people at after-dinner talks. I suppose they are people who are trying to advance their careers by impressing their bosses. Well, my career is not going to advance any longer. It's about where I'm happy to be. But we're at a conference where we all share something really special, and that's the use and application of technology for creating music that's rich in content, expressive, and ever evolving. We spend these 2 days looking at all these devices, most of which are probably new within the last few years. And it's hard for me to imagine when I first began my work that this would ever evolve into such a large distribution of energy and talent and good people. So I celebrate with you this evening, and I'll let you know how I got into this field. When I began, 1964, I was a drummer. I played jazz, pretty good jazz. When I was studying in Paris, there was a group that needed a drummer for a break when their own drummer was off for, and that was the original drummer of the Modern Jazz Quartet, whose name escapes me for the moment. A black musician, wonderful drummer. They let me sit in, and they counted off the beat, and it was extremely fast. They had to know whether I could play with their quartet. And I got through it, but my wrists were burning, and he thanked me, and they didn't call me back. But I learned something. And what I learned was it didn't at all affect my desire to be a musician or play drums. I realized that I'd done all I could, done the best I could, practiced hard, but sometimes the limitations are beyond one's control. So what do? You keep going. And Max Matthews wrote an article in November 1973 about the first use of digital computers for making music. So as a drummer, I played in the Stanford Symphony. And one of my colleagues, I was the timpanist at that time, one of my colleagues, a drummer, a biologist by training, she read science. I had never read science. I had told her about my experiences in Europe, studying in Paris in 1959 to 1962, and hearing electronic music for the first time. People like Stockhausen and Luciano Berio. And I told her of my dream to be able to make music for loudspeakers, but I had none of the skills that normally one would have to venture into such a domain. I was never a ham operator. As I say, I didn't know how to solder. but I was passionate about this idea. And this article by Max Matthews had a diagram, which I'll show you tomorrow at the presentation, which allowed me to get the concept, the basic concept of digital conversion from computers to a converter to a loudspeaker. And that's what set me off. And it was a wonderful adventure. I started out trying to recreate the sounds that Stockhausen had made in Kontakte, a piece in which has rotation of sounds through a quad space. He used a rotating loudspeaker with 4 microphones placed at the corner of a square, and then he put that onto a 4-channel tape, and that's how he created those illusions. As I took a programming course at Stanford, and I realized after becoming a modestly good programmer, that I might be able to do that in a digital domain in a more generalized way. So I started my work in creating moving sound sources with Doppler shift and sounds moving through space. And this led to the discovery of FM synthesis. What I needed was a signal which had internal dynamism, something that changed to separate itself out from the reverberant field in which sounds. So we had phase interference, which allows the ear to perceive, make a distinction between the reverberant signal and the direct signal. So that's when I started working on FM synthesis. Tomorrow I'll take you through that, the actual experiments that I did, how I discovered it. It was altogether an ear discovery. And maybe 3 or 4 years later, I said to Stanford University, Office of Technology Licensing, perhaps this has an application. So they investigated. The obvious application would be electronic organs. So they invited Lowry, who sent engineers. I explained what I was doing, which was a computer program that produced sounds that were recorded on tape. And they would ask me, well, how many chips does it take? And I said, well, I don't know. I'm not an engineer, but this is the algorithm, and maybe that's for you to figure out. Then they sent Wurlitzer, and Wurlitzer came, same story. They sent Hammond, and the person they sent was Don Lewis. He was a demonstrator for Hammond, and he understood immediately, with his wonderful ears, the importance of this, told the engineers, go back, check it out. And they came, but the same story. They had no idea about digital domain. So Stanford Office of Technology Licensing was kind of lost. They didn't know where to go. And then they discovered, some graduate student working in the business school got on the case and discovered that Yamaha was the largest music manufacturer in the world, but their presence in the United States at that time was pianos primarily and some organs, but they did not have a huge market. So they sent an engineer, and the engineer came from Los Angeles to Stanford, the artificial intelligence lab, where I was doing my work on weekends and late at nights because this was not funded research. And I explained to him what I was doing, showed him the algorithm, and he understood in 10 minutes. He got it. Because at that time, Yamaha was working on developing digital domain. And they had a famous engineer named Ralph Deutsch, I think, who developed the technology for the Allen organ, which was the first digital instrument ever, as far as I know, using IBM cards to load in waveforms. So they understood what I was doing. He went back and he reported to Yamaha management. They immediately contacted OTL and expressed their interest. Then I went off to Berlin on a sabbatical. And while I was there, they sent the general manager of Yamaha, Mochida, and a young engineer, Hiro Kato, who was new hire at Yamaha, very bright. I didn't have a tape recorder. I only had these examples on a 2-channel tape. So I didn't know how to manage that. So we walked into a audio shop on Kurfürstendamm in Berlin. And I asked the management if could I please just go off in the corner and play these examples for these 2 engineers. And I said, it's really important to me and they should sure go ahead. So I put the tape on and started explaining. And then a couple people came around, customers, and they were listening, and then some more people. And one of whom was the keyboard player in a group called Tangerine Dream. Now, I don't remember his name, unfortunately.
Edgar Freusse.
Yeah, then he contacted me after, and he wanted to know, when's it going to be an instrument? When's it going to be an instrument? And I said, I don't know. I knew nothing about synthesizers. In 1972, Buchla and Bob Moog had just began their first, I think, synths, as far as I remember. So he asked me, please keep in contact and let me know when this happens. Okay. So then they asked me to come to Japan. And this is one of those stories that you've probably heard before. I was told that Hiro Kato would not greet me. He had some other plans, and then someone alternative, some other guy would greet me. So I arrived at the airport, and there was no sign that said Chowning. You know, the old signs that are waiting for Europeans. Then all the people left. I was standing there alone, and a man came up to me and said, "Oh, that is all you mean?" No, I don't say that. I said, "I'm Chowning, Stanford," and he said, "Oh, yeah." So I got in his car, and we drove off to Tokyo. And halfway there, I said, are we going to Hamamatsu this evening? And he stopped and said, Hamamatsu? We're not going to Hamamatsu. And I said, are you Mr. Hiro Kato from Yamaha? He said, no. Are you Mr. Cleveland Schneider from Germany? So I said, please take me back to the airport. So I stood there, forlorn, not knowing what to do, and of course the loudspeaker saying, and I had no idea they were asking for me. And finally, Hiro Kato arrived, said he'd been looking for me, and we made it. So anyway, that's my Yamaha story. So I went back over the years, maybe 15 times, I guess. I never saw a single instrument. The X7 I didn't see until 1983, after a movie in a restaurant with a lounge that had a pianist where a pianist played, whom I knew. So my wife and I went in to have a beer, and he beckoned me over and said, look at this. And he showed me the DX7 sitting on his piano. And that was the first time I'd ever heard it, after seen it. I'd heard all the breadboard forms, of course, as the engineers, we worked together in developing the sounds, but I never knew what the directed result was going to be until I saw the DX7 in Palo Alto, California. So that's kind of the story of how FM got going. Don Lewis became a dear friend. We've known each other ever since that time. He and Roger Lynn, Tom Oberheim, McCarthy from Apple, the developer of the famous program, the name of which I forget, but we all see one another occasionally at birthday parties. They all live in the Bay Area, and they have a group of people who meet every Wednesday. They used to be in Berkeley called the Dead Presidents Club, and now they meet near Apple where Roger Lynn's wife works. And it's a wonderful community. And I told them that I would see all of you, and they said, pass our greetings. I want to say that at the end of this talk, I do have one funny story, and it's a bit of a performance, so I have to think about it. But during these days, the 2 days, if you get a picture with me, please send it to JC at CCRMA, karma.stanford.edu, where we have a big collection. I send them to Gu Wang, who has a large collection of Stanford Karma-related activities around the world, and that will be part of the Stanford archive. So please feel free to take a quick picture, but send it to jc at karma.stanford.edu. Now my funny story. David Bristow and I were both at IRCOM in 1975, and we worked on a book that was published by Yamaha called FM Synthesis by Musicians for Musicians. Dave Bristow was one of the two programmers, voicing programmers for the original DX7, he and Gary Leuenberger. And it was a wonderful experience. He has these ears and fingers, ears that are extremely refined, and keyboard technique, which I didn't have. So I couldn't voice the DX7. If you're going to voice a keyboard, you have to have people that know how to voice the keyboard, because it's such a subtle aspect of, musical expression, the key velocity and phrasing and everything. So I knew how to make the basic sounds, and I'll explain that tomorrow at the presentation. By the way, I would say that it's a sound synchronous animations that explain the basics of FM synthesis, so everyone will understand, I guarantee it. And so anyway, David and I worked on this book for a full year. It got published, and when in 1975, when I returned to Stanford, Yamaha asked me to come to Los Angeles for a presentation about the book, and he had a large room, maybe 200 people, interested new owners of DX7, wanting to hear about the theory. So I explained the book and how they would use it. Then in the back of the room, there was a guy a little bit smart aleck. He said, Dr. Chowning, what happens when you make the carrier frequency, fixed frequency at 1 hertz? You make the modulating frequency, fixed frequency at 1 hertz. You make the modulation index like 50. And he's thinking, well, there's a question he can think about. Then he said, this is the sound it makes. And he said, and I thought, let me think about how I'll answer that. So I thought, well, did you let it run on for a while? And he said, no. I said, because if you had, you would have heard this. Get a loop, get a loop, get a loop, read the book, read the book, read the book, read the book, read the book. And that's a true story. So, if we have time, I'd be happy to answer a question or two if anyone has a question. Yes, please.
Where did the DX7 name come from? Why 7?
DX7, I have no idea. Yamaha had this policy where they produced their first instrument, which was the DX1, I think, but was very expensive, where they set the kind of the terms of acceptance for the audience with high quality sounds, all the controls that they could do. Then they go down a few. DX7 was the one that they decided to produce. Of course, as you know, they vastly underestimated the sales. They had no idea, had no knobs. But and so it was quite unusual and unpredictable commercial success. They had no idea. It was unusual in the following sense. It had an odd sampling rate, something like 57 kilohertz sampling rate. The sine table was highly optimized. There was no standard bit width and length in the registers, because they were producing their own LSI chips. And so they wanted this to have as high sampling rate as possible to avoid the aliasing. And the question that this man in the back of the room asked, of course, the answer was what he was hearing were artifacts, because we were hearing, well, high sampling rate, who knows, there's probably no way to understand what was basically a random note generator, I guess. But there's a story about this with Brian Eno. He came to visit Stanford maybe 20 years ago, and we talked about music and electronic music and synthesizers. And he said, I have 8 DX7, but DX7-1s. And he said, I ordered a DX7-2 and I sent it back because it lost some of the sharpness in the attack on which he counted in his music, but also a very refined ear. And the reason was, of course, that DX7-2, they added micro-tuning, they added some other sample calculation processes. So at the moment the key made contact, they had to do computation, which delayed then the onset of the signal. And Brian Eno recognized that in his ear. And for that, I explained to him what had happened. He got it. And so that was an interesting kind of development, that the one which had the lower sampling rate, a DAC which was not as good as the DX7-2, yet it had a musical quality, an expressive aspect, an attribute that he wanted preserved. Any other questions? Yes.
You're most well known for FM synthesis. You're most well known for FM synthesis, but while at Karma, were there any other passion projects that you took just as much joy in as creating the algorithm for FM?
Are there any
other projects or research you did at Karma that
Yeah, the physical modeling synthesizer that Yamaha produced some years later. And, well, there's lots of stuff going on at Karma. There's a lot of basic research.
But what was your favorite, some of your other favorite projects you worked on?
Spatialization, yeah. And that, of course, now with domes of speakers, there's hardly an electronic music establishment anywhere that doesn't have at least 30 or 40. And You know, one of the greatest, I believe, one of the greatest additions in the electronic music world in the last 20 years was the subwoofer. I mean, the subwoofer gave composers power without boosting the music, the sound in the range where the ear is most sensitive, 1 to 4 kilohertz, where all the sibilants for speech are so important. And it also freed loudspeakers from having big membranes, so you can have high-quality, smaller cases that can be easily distributed in domes. And that has allowed a proliferation of wonderful simulations of remote spaces, like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. We transported the acoustics after doing measurements with sine sweeps and balloon pops, and did a big concert at Stanford in the new concert hall of music that was written for the Hagia Sophia, but no longer can be performed there because it's a museum. In the Turkish secular state, they can't do performance. So that's an amazing thing. The fact that we can transport the acoustics of a space to some remote location in another part of the earth and reproduce the music in that space that can no longer be performed in that space. That's good. And that touches musicologists. So when I began my work, the first year I was asked to explain to the music faculty, I was a graduate student, what I was doing. I said, well, I'm investigating making music with computers. So they asked me to play some examples. Well, I had just begun. I think I had a sine wave and maybe a few pitches. And their interest, of course, was not very great. But then after a musicologist said to me, I think what you're doing is dehumanizing music. And I said, well, I'm just investigating. I've only begun. And I explained the generality of the process and how it could evolve without theoretical limits, in fact. And I said, so maybe what I'm doing is humanizing computers. Well, when we did this Hagia Sophia concert at Bing, I thought of that moment, and I thought, this musicologist who studies early music, music historian, can now hear music performed in a space that otherwise he would never be able to hear. And of course, it affected very much the performance practice. So I thought, that's justification. Yeah. Okay. I think I'll stop, and I thank you again. I'm really excited about the presentation tomorrow, and